In the glittering world of high-stakes horse auctions, where the elite gather to exchange millions for prized thoroughbreds, there are whispers of legends that send chills down the spines of even the most hardened bidders. This is the story of one such legend, a magnificent black stallion with eyes that seem to hold the depth of midnight itself. They call him the Phantom, a horse whose bloodline promised greatness, whose form suggested speed that could outpace the wind. Yet, despite his obvious pedigree, no wealthy buyer would touch him. Not after what happened to the Henderson family, whose fortune crumbled within months of acquiring him. Not after the mysterious fire at the McDaniel stables. Not after 3 consecutive owners found themselves facing bankruptcy, illness, or worse. Keep your money in your pockets. The old-timers would warn whenever the Phantom appeared on the auction block. That beast carries more than just a rider on his back, he carries misfortune. For years, the Phantom passed from seller to seller, his price dropping with each transaction, the whispers of his curse growing louder, until that fateful spring auction in Kentucky. The auctioneer's voice had grown desperate as he tried to start the bidding at a mere fraction of what the stallion was worth. The crowd remained silent. The wealthy turned their backs. Even at a price that would have been considered theft, no one raised a paddle. No one except Tom Miller, a weathered farmer whose callous hands and sun-beaten face told the story of a life spent working the soil. A man whose entire savings wouldn't have bought the saddle the Phantom once wore. "What are you doing?" his wife had hissed at his side. "We can barely feed ourselves, let alone a horse that's brought down millionaires." But Tom saw something in those midnight eyes that others had missed. Behind the fear and distrust, behind the wild temperament that had fueled rumors of supernatural malice, he recognized a familiar pain, the pain of being misunderstood, labeled, and cast aside. Sometimes, Tom had said quietly, a bad reputation isn't earned. Sometimes it's given. With trembling hands, he signed the papers that transferred ownership of the Phantom to his modest farm, a decision that sent ripples of pity and mockery through the auction house. The wealthy buyers shook their heads, wondering how long it would take for the curse to claim yet another victim. They gave him 6 months, 6 months before the Miller farm would fall to ruin like all the others who had dared to own the Phantom. But what happened in those 6 months would shake the foundations of everything the horse racing world thought they knew about curses, about horses, and about the healing power of simple human kindness. Because when Tom Miller took that stallion home, he didn't see a curse walking up his driveway, he saw a second chance. What he couldn't possibly know was that this second chance would test everything he believed in, challenge the curse that had followed the Phantom for years, and ultimately reveal a truth so unexpected that it would forever change the lives of everyone involved. That first night at the Miller farm was anything but peaceful. The Phantom refused to enter the modest barn, rearing back and neighing with such ferocity that it woke the neighbors half a mile down the road. Tom's wife stood at the kitchen window, arms crossed, her face taut with worry as she watched her husband struggle with the massive stallion under the pale moonlight. "Just leave him be for tonight," she called out eventually, "before you break your neck trying to reason with a curse." Tom had reluctantly agreed, tethering the Phantom to a sturdy oak tree with enough slack to graze and move about. He hadn't slept that night, checking on the horse every hour, watching from the porch as the stallion paced in endless circles, those midnight eyes constantly darting toward the shadows as if expecting something or someone to emerge from them. What Tom didn't know then was the true history of the Phantom, a story that began not with curses, but with cruelty. Before the auctions, before the reputation, the Phantom had belonged to a renowned horse trainer whose methods were as effective as they were brutal. Behind closed barn doors, away from prying eyes, the trainer had beaten obedience into his prized horses, using pain as motivation and fear as control. The Phantom had been his greatest challenge and, ultimately, his greatest failure. The stallion's spirit refused to break, his wild nature impossible to subdue. When the trainer died suddenly of a heart attack while working with the Phantom, the whispers began. The stallion was sold to the Henderson family, who knew nothing of his traumatic past, only that he came with impressive bloodlines and a suspiciously reasonable price tag. What followed, the string of misfortunes that cemented the Phantom's reputation, were not the workings of supernatural forces but rather the consequences of trying to handle a deeply traumatized animal without understanding the wounds that lay beneath his magnificent exterior. By the end of that first week at the Miller farm, Tom was beginning to understand the magnitude of the challenge he'd taken on. The Phantom wouldn't let anyone approach him. He destroyed 2 sections of fencing, kicked a hole in the barn wall, and sent Tom's teenage son to the ground with a well-placed shoulder bump that might have been an accident, or might have been a warning. "Dad, this is hopeless," his son had said, nursing a bruised elbow. "You're pouring money we don't have into a horse that's determined to ruin us." But Tom had seen something else, moments when the Phantom would grow still, watching him work from across the paddock with a curious intensity. Moments when the stallion would approach the fence line when Tom sat quietly reading his newspaper after lunch, never close enough to touch, but close enough to suggest that beneath the fear and aggression lay something else, curiosity, perhaps, or loneliness. It was during the 3rd week that everything changed. A violent thunderstorm swept through the county, bringing with it torrential rain and wind strong enough to tear shingles from roofs. Tom had rushed out to check on the Phantom, expecting to find him wild with panic. Instead, he found the barn door torn from its hinges and no sign of the stallion. His heart sank. The fence along the north side of the property bordered a steep ravine. If the phantom had bolted in that direction during the storm, Tom grabbed a flashlight and raincoat, ignored his wife's pleas to wait until morning, and headed out into the howling darkness. What he found there, half a mile from home, would shake everything he thought he knew about the phantom, about curses, and about the unexpected ways healing can begin. The rain lashed at Tom's face as he followed muddy hoofprints down toward the ravine, his flashlight beam swinging wildly through sheets of water. The thunder had faded to distant rumbles, but the wind still howled through the trees. As he neared the edge of the steep drop, his heart pounded against his ribs, then stopped completely at what he saw below. The phantom stood on a narrow ledge halfway down the ravine, his powerful body shielding something from the storm. As Tom carefully made his way closer, he realized with shock that the horse was standing guard over a small, wet bundle, a foal that had slipped down the muddy embankment, its terrified mother pacing uselessly at the top of the ridge. The foal belonged to the Wilsons, whose farm bordered Tom's property. Their mare must have given birth during the storm, and somehow the newborn had wandered and fallen. Now, impossibly, the supposedly cursed demon horse was keeping the tiny creature warm, nudging it gently whenever it tried to move closer to the edge. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom whispered. The phantom's ears flicked toward him, those midnight eyes watching warily as Tom approached. For the first time since bringing the stallion home, Tom saw no aggression in that gaze, only wariness and what looked strangely like concern. It took 3 harrowing hours to rescue the foal, with the phantom allowing Tom close enough to secure a rope around the little one. When they finally brought both animals to safety, the phantom followed Tom back to the farm without resistance, walking calmly beside him as if they'd been partners for years. Word of the night's events spread quickly through the community. Jack Wilson, the foal's owner, arrived the next morning, hat in hand. "Heard what your cursed horse did," he said gruffly. "Never would have believed it if my wife hadn't seen it with her own eyes when you brought our little one home." Tom just nodded, watching the phantom grazing peacefully in the morning sun. "Thing is," Jack continued, shifting uncomfortably, "we've been thinking about selling up. Can't keep up with the big operations anymore, and the bank's breathing down our necks." Tom felt a pang of sympathy. Many small farms in the area were struggling, his own included. "What's that got to do with my horse?" he asked. Jack cleared his throat. "Got a call this morning from Helen Porter." Tom raised his eyebrows. Helen Porter owned the largest equine therapy center in the state, a place where troubled kids and veterans work with horses as part of their recovery. "She wants to see the phantom," Jack said. "Heard about what happened last night and said she's never heard of a horse, especially one with his reputation, showing that kind of protective instinct toward a foal that isn't even his own." Tom frowned. "He's not for sale. She doesn't want to buy him," Jack replied. "She wants to hire him, and you. Says a horse like that could be worth his weight in gold for her program." Meanwhile, across town in his sprawling estate, Richard Blackwood watched footage of the phantom's rescue on his iPad. The wealthy businessman had attended every auction where the phantom had appeared, watching from the shadows as the horse's price dropped with each sale. He'd been furious when the Miller farmer had bought the horse before he could make his move. "Turn that off," his wife snapped, entering his study. "I don't know why you're obsessed with that monster, after what it did to your brother's stables." "My brother was a fool who didn't understand what he had," Richard said coldly. "That horse carries the bloodline of Eclipse's Storm." His wife paled. Eclipse's Storm had been Richard's pride and joy 20 years ago, an unbeatable racehorse mysteriously stolen the night before the Kentucky Derby, never to be seen again. The theft had become racing legend, along with rumors that the horse had been slaughtered by rivals or hidden away to breed future champions in secret. "You can't possibly think," she began. "I know," Richard interrupted. "The markings, the build, the speed described by every owner before the accidents began. The phantom is Eclipse's grandson, and I want what's mine." Back at the Miller farm, Tom was showing Helen Porter around the modest stables. The phantom watched them from his paddock, ears pricked forward with interest. For a horse with such a dark reputation, he seemed remarkably calm as Helen approached the fence. "The reports I've heard about this horse don't match what I'm seeing," she said thoughtfully. "People see what they expect to see," Tom replied. "Call something cursed long enough, and folks will blame it for every bit of bad luck that comes their way." Helen nodded slowly. "I'd like to bring one of our clients here tomorrow, if that's all right with you. A 14-year-old girl who hasn't spoken a word since witnessing her parents' death in a car accident 3 years ago." Tom hesitated, looking at the phantom. "Are you sure that's safe?" "No," Helen admitted. "But I've worked with troubled horses and troubled kids for 15 years. Sometimes the most wounded souls recognize something in each other that the rest of us miss." What neither of them knew was that Richard Blackwood had already set his plan in motion. That night, as Tom's family slept peacefully for the first time since bringing the phantom home, a dark figure slipped through the shadows toward the barn, wire cutters gleaming in the moonlight. The sharp whinny from the phantom pierced the night, jolting Tom from his sleep. He scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over his boots as he rushed downstairs. Outside, the motion-activated floodlights had triggered, illuminating the yard in harsh white light. A dark pickup truck was speeding away down the driveway, and the phantom was rearing wildly in his paddock, the newly cut fence wires dangling uselessly. Tom ran to the horse, who was trembling but unharmed. In the dirt nearby lay the wire cutters and a tranquilizer dart that had missed its target. The phantom had not only evaded capture but had alerted the entire farm. By morning, Sheriff Reynolds was examining tire tracks while Tom recounted everything he knew about Richard Blackwood and his connection to Eclipse's storm. The sheriff nodded grimly. Blackwoods had run-ins with the law before over horses. Nothing that stuck, but rumors follow that man like shadows. 2 days later, the sheriff returned with news that sent shockwaves through the county. A search of Blackwood's property had uncovered documentation proving that the phantom was indeed the grandson of Eclipse's storm, along with records of how Blackwood had engineered the horse's curse to drive down his price, from hiring stable hands to mistreat him to orchestrating accidents that befell previous owners. He was playing a long game, the sheriff explained, making everyone believe the horse was bad luck so he could eventually buy him for nothing. When you got him instead, well, he gestured to the cut fence. Desperate men do desperate things. But the biggest surprise came that afternoon when Helen Porter arrived with Lily, the silent teenager who had witnessed her parents' death. The girl's therapist and social worker hovered nervously as she approached the fence where the phantom stood watching. What happened next would be talked about for years to come. The phantom, who had spent years avoiding human touch, lowered his head to the girl's outstretched hand. Lily's fingers trembled as they brushed his velvety nose. For a long moment, they stood frozen in that gentle connection, two wounded souls recognizing something in each other that others had missed. Then Lily spoke. He was scared, she whispered, her voice rusty from years of silence. Not bad, not cursed, just scared. 6 months later, the Miller farm had transformed. With Blackwood facing charges and the phantom's true lineage established, offers had poured in to breed the stallion, providing the funds to save not just the Miller farm but also to purchase the neighboring Wilson property. But Tom had different plans. Working with Helen, he converted both farms into an expanded equine therapy center, where the phantom led a growing herd of rescued horses. Troubled teens, veterans with PTSD, and children with disabilities found healing in the same fields where the phantom had once been considered a harbinger of doom. On a golden autumn afternoon, Tom leaned against the fence, watching Lily leading a riding lesson for younger children, her voice clear and confident as she explained how to approach a horse with respect and kindness. Beside him, the phantom stood relaxed and attentive, his once fearful eyes now calm and trusting. Tom reached out to stroke the horse's gleaming neck. Sometimes a bad reputation isn't earned, Tom murmured, echoing his words from the auction house that seemed so long ago. And sometimes all it takes to break a curse is someone who refuses to believe in it. The phantom nickered softly in agreement, as behind them, the sun set on a farm no longer defined by fear, but transformed by understanding, second chances, and the healing power of seeing beyond appearances to the truth that lies beneath.